Late last week, Hamas gave initial approval to a U.S.-backed proposal for a phased truce and hostage exchange deal in Gaza, dropping a key demand that Israel commit up front to a complete end to the war. At the same time, a key stumbling block appeared to be Hamas's desire for, quote, written guarantees from mediators that Israel will continue to negotiate a permanent ceasefire deal once its first phase goes into effect. A Hamas representative told the Associated Press that the group's approval came after it received, quote, verbal commitments and guarantees from mediators that the war will not be resumed and that negotiations will continue until a permanent ceasefire is reached. The Hamas representative said, quote, now we want these guarantees on paper. Then, according to a news report Friday, Mossad chief David Barnea informed Qatari mediators that Israel rejects Hamas's demand for a written commitment from mediators that the negotiations regarding the second phase of the ceasefire can extend indefinitely if needed. And, on Sunday, ahead of the Israeli negotiating team's departure for further hostage deal talks in Egypt and Qatar this week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presented a list of what he said were 4 non-negotiable Israeli demands, including a guarantee that Israel could resume fighting, which would need to be met in any hostage release and ceasefire deal with Hamas. Netanyahu's statement, at a crucial phase ahead of the resumption of talks, sparked anger, both in Israel and among mediators, with some accusing him of attempting to sabotage hard-won progress. Hamas responded by saying that Netanyahu is putting hurdles in front of ceasefire negotiations during ongoing talks aimed at reaching a deal to end the war in Gaza. The group, in a statement, called on mediators to intervene against what it called, quote, maneuvers and crimes by Netanyahu. The 4 non-negotiable Israeli demands from Netanyahu are, in full: 1. Any deal will allow Israel to return to fighting until its war aims are achieved. 2. Weapons smuggling to Hamas from the Gaza-Egypt border will not be possible. 3. The return of thousands of armed terrorists to the northern Gaza Strip will not be possible. And 4. Israel will maximize the number of living hostages who will be returned from Hamas captivity. I never voted for Netanyahu's Likud party and would like to see another person lead the Jewish state, mainly because he has been in this position for far too long. But I have learned to compartmentalize my own thoughts and feelings about Netanyahu when analyzing this war, including but not limited to these 4 non-negotiable Israeli demands. As far as I am concerned, they are not only perfectly legitimate, but also completely necessary, for now other reason than the most obvious fact that Hamas is a self-proclaimed genocidal Islamist terrorist organization. Say it with me: terrorist organization. And it is not as if Hamas was not founded yesterday. They have a very long, detailed history of habitually playing deceiving, disingenuous games. Surprise, surprise. While not having a lick of care about so-called international law or any other norm to which we hold other countries like Israel. This is what makes negotiating with terrorist organizations so incredibly stupid. Hamas is throwing darts, while Israel is being forced by the West to play tennis. It is a totally asymmetric attempt at negotiations, ultimately designed to make Israel the cold, hard loser, if not in intention, then in outcome. In Israel and the greater Middle East, and unlike Western conventional wisdom, there is no such thing as a win-win situation. If one side wins, the other automatically loses. This goes for deals of all kinds, from business and government to interpersonal relationships. Knowing these win-lose rules of the game, why in the world would Israel hand Hamas a victory after what it perpetrated on October 7th? And why should Israel stop in its tracks after being well on its way to badly beating Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other Gaza-based Palestinian terrorists? Indeed, several senior Hamas figures in Gaza have urged the terror group's political leadership to accept the ceasefire and hostage deal proposal championed by U.S. President Joe Biden. according to internal communications seen by the Associated Press. The messages, shared by a Middle East official familiar with the ongoing negotiations, described the heavy losses that Hamas has suffered on the battlefield and the dire conditions in the war-ravaged territory. The communications from May and June suggested that the war had taken a toll on Hamas fighters, with the senior figures urging the group's political wing abroad to accept the deal despite the reluctance of Yahya Sinwar, the group's leader in Gaza, who has been in hiding since the war erupted and is believed to be holed up in a tunnel deep underground, either not fully aware of the fighting's toll or not fully communicating it to those negotiating outside of the territory. Hence why, over the weekend, Hamas appeared to drop its long-standing demand that Israel promise to end the war that Hamas started as part of any deal, though Hamas indicated it was still demanding guarantees to that effect from mediators. True to form, this is exactly the strategy that Israeli leadership has told us about from day one. Military pressure on Hamas and its supporters will bend them to make an Israel-friendly deal. And it seems to be working, though there is still some way to go. We are already 9 months into this war, so what is another month or two? No doubt, another month or two of intense fighting in Gaza could very well jeopardize the lives of the remaining living hostages, and I am all for keeping the hostages alive and returning them home as soon as possible. But if I was running Israel, I would make it clear to senior Hamas officials behind closed doors that they have two choices. Number 1, ensure our hostages do not die, go into exile, and relinquish control of the Gaza Strip. Or number 2, if you do not check all these 3 boxes, we, Israel, will forcibly take control of the Gaza Strip out of your hands and then assassinate you wherever you are in the world, above or below ground. The reality is that senior Hamas officials preach jihad for everyone except themselves. They don't want to die. Some 1,700 of them have become millionaires because of Hamas, because of terrorism, and even a few of them are billionaires who love their lives and prefer this one over the Islamic afterlife and its so-called 72 virgins in paradise. Yet much of the West's political leaders seem to be siding with Hamas, not necessarily in rhetoric, but more consequentially in action. Pining for a hostage deal that stops Israel's military achievements and ultimately results in the IDF withdrawing from Gaza prematurely, thus leaving Hamas in governing control of the Strip, is indeed an act of siding with Hamas. The United States is even trying to bribe Israel by communicating to the Jewish state that, if an agreement for a hostage deal and ceasefire is reached, Egypt will work with the U.S. to help build a high-tech underground barrier to prevent the smuggling of weapons into Gaza, according to a recent report from Israel's Army radio. Mind you, this is the same United States that spent more than $320 million to build a pier to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza that the Palestinians do not want and that the Americans cannot get to work. Now the U.S. is trying to convince Israel that they can build a quote-unquote high-tech underground barrier to prevent the smuggling of weapons into Gaza. That is a bunch of malarkey, to borrow a line from the mouth of Joe Biden during his pitiful presidential debate performance 2 weeks ago. Hence why Israel must not, under any circumstances, acquiesce to the West's delusional, corrupted, and conceited approach to the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war and a potential hostage deal. If that means Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant telling Western leaders, with all due respect, to fuck off, so be it. Ironically, that would be to the West's benefit. All we have to do is look at what the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hamas' chief sponsor, is currently trying to do in Jordan to know how dangerous Iran's terror tentacles are to the Middle East and ultimately the West. To create a terror stronghold in Jordan, Iran is using its tried and true method of regional expansion, its proxy militias. Iran and Hamas have a marriage of convenience. Iran uses Hamas to fuel the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under the pretext of quote-unquote liberating Palestine in order to strengthen its influence in Arab countries. Hamas, in turn, uses Iran's military and financial support to escalate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to my friend and longtime Israeli security official Avi Melamed, targeting Jordan is a shared goal for Hamas, a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is committed to establishing a global caliphate. Hamas's Islamic Emirate in Gaza is its first stage. The next one is destroying Israel in order to establish an Islamic Emirate in the territory presently known as the State of Israel, as well as the West Bank. Jordan is next. Expanding the Hamas-controlled Islamic Emirate into Jordan would put Hamas 3 steps closer towards its goal of a global Islamic caliphate. Despite having a peace treaty with Israel, anti-Israel sentiments are widespread in Jordan. This is partly because so many Jordanians are historically Palestinians, no less because of the active presence of Islamists in the country. In May 2024, Murad al-Adileh, a Hamas-affiliated Jordanian politician, became the Secretary General of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. In an interview with Al Jazeera, he urged the government to improve relations with Hamas and the resistance movement, as well as to, quote, push back against the Israeli threat. According to Melamed, the strategy is as follows. Iran and Hamas escalate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and then exploit widespread public hostility in Jordan towards Israel. As the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war evolves and Israeli military pressure on Hamas in Gaza increases, Hamas leaders call on Jordanians to protest by any means. Responding to that call, Islamists in Jordan have and continue to initiate protests and demand the Jordanian government abolish its peace treaty with Israel. Some of these have become so violent and disruptive that Jordanian security forces have had to suppress them with force. According to Melamed, Iran's goal is to turn Jordan into a launching base for attacks against Israel. In the early stages of the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war, Iraqi militias loyal to Iran asked Jordan to open its border so they could reach the Israeli-Jordanian border to fight Israel. Jordan refused. Israel should follow suit by A, refusing to be a pawn in much of the West's own domestic political affairs, even as Israel stands up for the West in the Middle East, and B, countering this Iran-Hamas master plan by systematically dismantling their so-called axis of resistance. First, Israel takes care of Hamas in Gaza, then they proceed to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are also the Houthis in Yemen and other pro-Iran, that is, anti-Israel militias in Syria and Iraq, but Hezbollah and Hamas are by far 2 of the most prominent Iranian proxies. Once Israel deals them lethal blows, all roads lead to Tehran, where hopefully Israel and the West can do the Iranian people a favor by removing the Ayatollah and his crony regime from power. Naturally, this would involve tremendous amounts of dirty work that takes a long, long time and thus requires a ton of patience from Western populaces. But if we truly want so-called peace in the Middle East, then Israel and the West must go to the source of the problem. Of course, I am talking about Iran and its Islamist axis of resistance. As a matter of fact, many countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and Jordan, would be more than willing partners in the fight against the Iranian octopus. The other option is to force a hostage deal on Israel and hand Hamas a completely undeserved victory, because Western leaders are increasingly struggling to sell the continuation of the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war to their own people, either due to incompetence or to a foreign actor, such as Qatar and/or Iran, compensating them to hold Israel back from achieving a justified victory. By doing so, these Western leaders would essentially be inviting more of the most grotesque, inhumane Islamist terrorism, not only against Israel, but against every country in the West.